So, David, as we said before, you were the author of a report called Late Lessons from Early Warnings, which was for the European Environment Agency. And in that, you talked about problems that occurred when society ignored early warnings and waited for absolute proof before taking action to protect people. So, in your opinion, should we be applying those sorts of precautions to wireless radiation?
Yes, absolutely. The two volumes you mentioned were done in partnership with 80 authors, 80 scientists who
Mm.
kindly gave their time in writing chapters on 35 different case studies. So the man who discovers the hole in the ozone layer, Joe Farman, passed away unfortunately now, he writes the chapter in volume one on the CFCs hole in the ozone story.
Mm.
And a wonderful man called Maurice Greenberg, who set up the mesothelioma register, mesothelioma being the worst of the three or four cancers you can get from asbestos, he co-authored the chapter on asbestos with myself and two top people from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, wrote the chapter in volume two on climate change. And in each case, I asked the authors to give us at the beginning of the chapter, when was the first plausible scientific early warning that something might be going wrong? And perhaps your viewers will be astonished to hear that it was 1896 for X-rays, a chapter in volume one,
Mm.
1897 for climate change. A wonderful Swedish physicist on the back of an envelope just said, if we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from pre-industrial levels to double that, i.e. from about 270 parts per million to over 500 parts per million, we will raise the average temperature of the globe by about 4 degrees, 4 to 5 degrees centigrade. That was 1897. Currently, the 2,000 or so scientists gathered within IPCC, the UN body that looks at the science every 5 years and tells us what the heck's happening with climate change, their best estimate at the moment as to what the effect of doubling CO2 in the atmosphere would be is about 3 to 4, 2 to 3, 4, honing in on about 3 degrees C. In other words, he was remarkably accurate with his back of the envelope calculation. And so that's how the chapters are structured. Firstly, when was this first plausible early warning? And 1898 was asbestos, when a wonderful lady factory inspector said, I'm looking at these fibers down my microscope at home I've just taken from this asbestos factory, and those needle-like fragments will do untold damage to the lungs of workers, as might have been expected, she said, 1898. That was published in the Chief Inspector of Factories report, but ignored. And we only got round to banning asbestos in the 80s. And now we've got in the UK alone about 5,000 cancer deaths, new cancer deaths per year. So the books were produced in order to learn from history and to apply the lessons of history in order to avoid similar tragedies to that of climate change, ozone layer, lead in petrol, and asbestos. And in the case of the fields that you're interested in and that you have been wonderfully campaigning on for 27 years, electromagnetic fields of the non-ionizing sort, early warnings, there was a huge report done in 1972 by the US Naval Academy, looking at all the scientific publications
Mm.
available at that time, indicating possible, probable biological harm to people. For me, I only began to look at this field in 2006 when I was asked to have a look at it because I was in a position at the EEA to do that kind of thing. And I noticed that an old colleague of mine whom I'd known from the past in the 80s on pesticides, where he was proven correct, a man called Professor Leonard Hardell,
Oh,
had had done the first human study that I was aware of and published it in 1999, where he showed that for the long term users of mobile phones, particularly those who had their brain tumors on the same side of the head as where they routinely use the phone, that's called ipsilateral, he found nearly twofold, approximately twofold excess of brain tumors. And when I saw that paper, I thought, oh my goodness me, there's millions of people out there, particularly children, pressing the phones next to their heads, and we could have another asbestos tragedy in the making. Since then, the big milestones were the International Agency for Research on Cancer, a World Health Organization body, in 2011 assembled 36 experts for a week down in Lyon, looked at the available evidence on radio frequency radiations from mobile phones and other devices like routers and computers and microwave ovens and so on. And they concluded, just on the basis of what they had then, which were 2 human studies indicating the possibility that there could be brain tumors from long-term use of the phones. So they concluded that it was a possible carcinogen. RFR, radio frequency radiations from phones and masts, is a possible carcinogen, said IARC in 2011. It was at that time that Lloyd's Insurance of London, later reinforced by Swiss Re, one of the 2 global reinsurance companies in 2019, both of them said, we are not insuring the telecoms industry because we fear another asbestos could be in the making. And so companies in the US in particular have to tell shareholders in their annual reports, we have not got cover for possible liability cases in the future that may affect your shares. So if one just takes the view of the insurance world, one would be very precautionary right now with RFR from mobile phones, masts, etc. And the final big chunk of evidence that's come in 2018, 2019 was from 2 big long-term, by that I mean it took them 5 or 10 years to do because it was very carefully done, animal studies, rats and mice, showing independently from each other that the doses you get from mobile phones or from masts, in the case of the Italian study, showed clear evidence, very clear evidence, the highest strength of evidence you can get from animal studies, indicating that tumors and heart problems were caused by these low amounts of radiation. And we know from the history of all other carcinogens, many of which are described in the 35 case studies of late lessons reports, that high quality predictive animal studies help us to anticipate cancer that could occur in humans some 10, 20, 30 years after first exposure, because that's what often happens with what you call solid tumors like brain or lung or whatever, that we can anticipate that by relying on good quality animal studies. So that for many people who are independent of the telecoms industry and who know the EMF field, the combination of the now 4 or 5 human studies and the 2 big animal studies are more than sufficient to say to people, do take precautions with this stuff. First of all, as a personal level, obey the guidance given by the telecoms industry themselves in the small print of the box, in the box when you buy a phone or a computer or a router. It will say keep the computer at least 20 centimeters away from any bodily contact, i.e. don't put it on your lap. With phones, depending on the company, they say keep it within 5 or 25, in the case of Motorola, millimeters away from your skin. In other words, do not put the phone there and use it at a distance via texting or via what you know about these not air fed, but air cooled.
Air tube headsets.
Air tube headsets, that's right. Which enable you to get all the benefits from the phone, but with much, much, much lower radiation. The radiation falls off, not in a linear fashion, but in what's called an exponential fashion. So that just moving the phone, 20 centimeters or 5 or 10 centimeters away from the head is giving you a much, much lower dose.
Which is not the way people use these devices normally, is it? But I'd like to point out that what you said is that this is the industry itself saying keep their devices away from your body. That still doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be safe, does it?
No, because absolutely not.
Even
no, yeah, that's a very good point. I do make this point to people, though, because not many people know that. They don't know that the industry, as told by their lawyers, probably sometime after the IARC conclusion in 2011, they told the lawyers for the company said, look, put a warning sign in the box somewhere so that when or if there are future compensation cases, we'll be able to point to that warning sign and say it was the consumer's fault. Now, that actually won't wash in terms of a defense. Normally speaking, you have to do a lot more than that to escape liability. But at least for them, it's better than nothing. And for us, the consumers, it shows us that at least they think there's something worth warning about. But as you say, keeping it, say, 5 millimeters away, which is what Apple recommends, is not going to be safe because the companies rely on ICNIRP, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiations, and its guidelines, which many scientists have shown, and particularly recently the ICBE, the International Commission on Biological Effects of EMF, recently launched and recently published a paper that shows that the ICNIRP guidelines are fundamentally flawed, completely invalid to protect people from long-term, low-level, varying amounts of RFR, particularly for those who are more sensitive to it, like children, fetuses, pregnant women, immunocompromised, and so on. Which is why some countries, particularly Russia, China, and many in East European countries, and Italy and Switzerland, are recommending much lower limits. So my meter that I use to illustrate the presence of RFR fields has a maximum limit of just 6 volts per meter, because that's one of the Italian public exposure limit restrictions. Whereas the amount that ICNIRP recommends that you can have in Australia or me in London or people in the US, it comes in at 61 volts per meter because it's based on the wrong kind of science, essentially. So your point is a good one. Keeping it away from the body is a good thing, a very good thing to do, but it's not necessarily safe if the exposures you're getting are still anywhere near 1 volt per meter, in my view.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Now, just going back to those precautionary, the studies that you told us about before, where people had found in the 1890s, was it, that asbestos was harmful? And it took to the 1980s for regulations to be introduced. That's an incredible time span. Do you have any thoughts why it's taking society long?
Yeah. One of the purposes of doing this particular historical analysis was to chart the growth of the evidence from zero and then the first early warning to a lot. And then see why did it take so long for society in its various forms, i.e. individuals, NGOs, companies, doctors, scientists, governments, companies, blah, blah. Why did it take so long for action to be taken? And there are 3 or 4 key answers to that question that are present in most of the case studies. The first one is that there are very powerful economic interests whose products are threatened immediately by the first early warning. So whether it's be the tobacco industry, the lead industry, the fossil fuel industry, the beryllium industry, all these industries had their products questioned by independent scientists, and therefore they saw it as a threat to their economic interests, which of course in the short term it was. So they acted to stop that early warning getting much further. Often they literally harassed the professors concerned. Professor Needleman, who produced the first really convincing paper in 1979 that showed brain damage to children breathing in city fumes laden with lead from the leaded petrol, they went after him in a very serious manner. He was prevented from doing research for 3 or 4 years while he defended his reputation. I call them harassed early warning scientists, and they're throughout the case studies. There's about 50 of them in the case studies. Selikov for asbestos, Chapella for GMOs, and in lead, Needleman. And in this field, Henry Lai, Leonard Hardell himself, several others, key figures.
Ollie Johansson.
Gert Oberfeld, I think, and probably several others we don't know about, but we do know about some of them. They too were harassed. And that's because the economic interest, as perceived by the people selling the devices or the things that caused the initial early warning, felt threatened. So that's one big reason. We now need to, in my view, give protection to early warning scientists by giving them some recognition for the work they do. And I'm backing something called the Henrik Ibsen Award for harassed early warning scientists that we can talk about some other time, perhaps.
Good.
So that's the first big reason. The second is that then the industry will pay scientists to manufacture doubt. So they harass the early warning scientists. The next stage is you now pay scientists to manufacture doubt about the findings of the early warning scientists. This goes back a long way. When Galileo said, actually, the Earth is not the center of the universe, and actually it's round and not flat, the Catholic Church was not impressed. And they called for scientists to rubbish Galileo's claims. And then they went a step further into the harassment field and put him in court and said, you'll be executed, Galileo, unless you tell us you will not spread your teachings any further. And he was under house arrest, and that's where he died. So you silence the opposition, or you pay people to muddy the waters. There are two wonderful books. One's called Merchants of Doubt. One's called, I forget the other one. The other one being by David Michaels, and the first one by Oreskes. And they just chronicle in those two volumes the history of manufacturing doubt. And the best, one of the best examples of this is a memo sent by the tobacco industry to itself, an internal memo, after the publication of the big first mega human study of British doctors showing clear association between lots of smoking and lung cancer, published in 1955. The Medical Research Council of UK didn't like this conclusion because all doctors smoked in those days, and they helped to advertise cigarettes, for goodness sake. But by 1957, they said this evidence is fairly clear that smoking causes lung cancer. And then in 1964, the scientific argument was over with the publication of the US Surgeon General's report that said it definitely does cause cancer. But after that, the industry then moves to a different plane of influencing regulators and the public through this manufacturing of doubt stuff, which is why the memo is dated 1969, and it says to the industry, we must manufacture doubt, create doubt in the minds of the public so that we could preserve our product, tobacco, for another 10, 20, 30 years, which is what happened. So there are these stages, as it were, which are very similar in every case. And at the moment, the telecoms industry is actually more powerful, both organizationally, economic-wise, and politically, by that I mean links with top politicians and governments, than big tobacco or big asbestos ever was.
Oh, goodness.
So we're facing quite a big battle here, really. But I'm convinced that just as there are several good top scientists in the EMF field who perhaps maybe 20, 30 years ago thought that RFR could not really be biologically damaging below the tissue heating threshold, they're now recognizing that there are enough studies to indicate health effects well below the heating tissue threshold. And so they're shifting. And then there are court cases, as I've mentioned, in Italy and Holland and Germany, which not only explicitly say the ICNA group is not independent, they also say their exposure guidelines are not protective of people and so on. So change is in the air.
It's good to hear. So you were telling us these reasons why it takes society a long time to get the message that something is actually toxic, and for us to take action to reduce our exposure, I suppose. And you mentioned those two examples. Are there any other reasons why it takes society so long to wake up?
Well, perhaps I've missed off really a key one, which is what strength of evidence do you as a person, or does the government as a government want to use in order to restrict, say, asbestos, leaded petrol, RFR for mobile phones, etc.? The field of science necessarily uses a high strength of evidence in order to produce robust knowledge that will stand the test of time. So if I was just a pure scientist, I would really want evidence beyond all reasonable doubt that A causes B.
Yes.
I don't want to make a mistake. In other words, for me, a false, what they call a false positive, in other words, where you say A causes B, and then later on research shows that in fact that doesn't happen, that's far worse for a scientist to commit that error than the false negative, which is to say something is safe. Oops, no, it's not. It's hazardous. So from the point of view of the pure scientist, A, they want to avoid false positives more than false negatives. if you see what I mean. And they want to
Mm.
do that by using a very high level of proof, which is absolutely right for science.
Yes.
But when you're trying to protect people or the planet or wildlife or birds and bees and so on, as a regulator, as a politician, as a citizen, you're obviously not going to wait for evidence beyond all reasonable doubt, because by that time, the evidence that constitutes beyond all reasonable doubt is dead bees or dead people.
That's
So
right.
you've got to use a lower strength of evidence if you really want to protect people and planet. So where is another level strength, a lower strength of evidence? Well, in my chapter on more or less precaution, question mark, at the end of volume 2, I give a table of about 7 or 8 different strengths of evidence which are used for different purposes quite appropriately. And you just have to decide, well, which one is going to be appropriate to protect bees or people? And it's certainly not beyond all reasonable doubt, which is great for not hanging innocent people in the criminal courts. We only accuse, or rather, we only convict a person of a criminal act when the evidence is beyond all reasonable doubt. And if we don't reach that level, the person goes free. So, as the US textbooks say, the legal textbooks, it's better to let 10 murderers go free than it is to hang an innocent person.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an ethical question. Every citizen, every government has a right to say, "Oh no, I think I'd like to, reduce the strength of evidence a little bit, so as maybe only 2 people are wrongly accused, rather than or mistake. So only 2 murderers go free rather than 10. Blah blah blah. So it is an ethical choice, turning upon the simple question: what's the cost of being wrong, and who bears that cost? So elsewhere in my table and in society, people say, well, I think in this area here, the civil courts, not the criminal courts, the civil courts, where you've already got an injured party, fell off a ladder at work or got a tumor from a mobile phone or whatever, and then you're accusing somebody of giving you that harm through negligence. And in those sorts of cases, society has long decided, that beyond all reasonable doubt is not appropriate. It's too high. It's too harsh on the already injured party. So we give the benefit of any scientific or evidentiary evidence. We give the benefit of any, on any evidentiary uncertainty or scientific uncertainty to the injured party. And we say, on the balance of probabilities, or in America they call it the preponderance of evidence, 51% probability that I fell off the ladder because of my employer's negligence. I've got a brain tumor because of the telecoms company not reducing exposures low enough. And so the question is all the time, what's an appropriate strength of evidence? In a wonderful Swedish chemical law to protect people from chemicals, they come in at a very low level, saying if there's a sort of pertinent and relevant information, that's also in WTO, then action can be taken to protect people from these things. And so in the case of IARC, it has these 3 categories: possible carcinogen, probable carcinogen. So possible is widely accepted as below 50% probability. Probable is above 50% probability. And then the highest category is proven. So all the time you're negotiating with yourself and with the companies and with the governments as to where in this range, this continuum. It's not, is it safe? Is it not safe? Life is much more complex than that. It is usually a continuum. Indications of a harm, an early warning, and at the top end, beyond all reasonable doubt, it kills you. And somewhere in the middle is the point where you want to take action to reduce exposures, to minimize tragedy, to minimize harm, really.
Mm. Mm. Oh, so it's a lot more complicated than we thought. But should we be taking action to reduce exposure to wireless radiation now as a society, do you think?
Oh, well, absolutely, because the early warning stuff of the 1970s is long gone.
Mm.
The early warning of Hardell in 1999 is long gone. 2011, when IARC said it's a possible carcinogen, as they did incidentally in 2002 for the radiations coming from overhead power lines, because that too is
Mm.
non-ionizing radiation. But there, the numbers of people exposed in Western
Mm.
countries is
Mm.
much smaller, and the
Mm.
twofold excess in leukemia that we get from that kind of exposure occurs when children are born and brought up within about 400 meters of the overhead power line. But that's another illustration of how early on, 2002 in the case of
Yeah.
IARC, the non-ionizing radiations, which many people thought were quite safe because they didn't have enough energy to strip
Mm.
electrons from molecules and so on, is in fact capable of giving childhood leukemias to young fetuses and children who are brought up living near overhead power lines. So that was 2002, 2011. Then we get this huge amount of animal study, very clear evidence in 2018, 2019, and we've got 3 or 4 more human studies showing brain tumors, and 1 or 2 coming in showing breast cancers from women who keep the phones in their bras and so on,
Mm.
and thyroid cancers perhaps is coming in now. So we've got, in my view, more than sufficient evidence to take precautionary steps right now. As we said from the Environment Agency, when we first looked at this in 2007, we issued an early warning, which is quite unique for our organization, that
Mm.
said the evidence looks like this, the numbers exposed are so big, and because some of them are so sensitive, like children, we said
Mm.
take precautions now. We reissued that in 2009 and in 2011. And looking back on the words we used to characterize the risk then and what could be done in a precautionary fashion to reduce future harm, I think it was very, very reasonable advice that we gave. And we said at the time, we hope we are wrong. We really hope with our hands on our hearts that we're wrong with this one, because the numbers expose them in the billions rather than
Yes.
millions. Unfortunately, the evidence has got a lot stronger, and now action is really needed, both at the individual level and in the telecoms industry level, to say
Mm.
we can engineer this stuff. We can engineer this stuff better to
Yes.
deliver benefits without the risks, and for governments to tell them to do that. Those 3 things need to happen.
Absolutely. And what about 5G? So you're talking about taking precaution to reduce exposure to probably what we've got already, but now we're talking about rolling out 5G right across the planet, and we will have infinitely more exposure from that, more antennas inside our homes, outside our homes, in smart cities and so forth.
Yeah.
What do you think about that from the point of view of
This
precaution
is
and
this is
common sense?
yeah. This is where I found the late lessons volume so extremely useful,
Mm.
because I couldn't spell 5G more than 3 years ago, and
Mm.
then one of the committees at the House of Commons says we want to look at 5G, and I thought, well, I better have a look at 5G as well. And I was struck immediately and sent in my evidence along these lines by the fact that there were so many similarities with 5G compared to asbestos, lead in petrol, and so on. As a, for instance, industry experts, independent industry telecoms engineer type experts, wrote papers for the EU, which I discovered, that said there is a lot of marketing hype around 5G, which doesn't seem to stand up to reality. The business case, even, leave alone harm, is a bit poor, they said. And I looked at the histories of, say, lead, and noticed that the marketing hype captured in the phrase, uh, this is a gift from God, said GM. The 1-day trial of leaded petrol, which took place in May 1925, read about it in the chapter. The head of GM said, this leaded petrol is a gift from God. And nuclear energy, I remember this myself, when it was introduced in the 50s, it was going to be so cheap that they wouldn't have to meter the energy that you got from nuclear power. So it was, the hype was there then. And in leaded petrol, I've done, what was the other one? Asbestos was called the magic mineral for decades. So this hype helps people to think, wow, this is fantastic, and their natural inquisitiveness, their objectivity kind of melts away with the rhetoric of what all this stuff is doing. So that was the first thing I noticed. 5G was going to be the Internet of Things. It was going to do a million things for everybody. And you looked at some of the detail, and one of the details was, it said, oh, well, with this 5G, if you're playing video games, The response time when you're playing a video game, it's called the latency. We can get it down from 40 milliseconds down to 1 millisecond with 5G. And I'm thinking, what? You're doing that? I mean, what is the real benefit, except some freaky people at one end of a spectrum who will notice the difference between 40 milliseconds and 1 millisecond? And for something that you're going to spread all across the environment with masts, unlike the 4G masts, which are several hundred meters away, usually, these 5G things are stuck on lampposts and near housing, and very densification of the 5G masts, bathing people with 24 hours exposure for the sake of 140 to 1 millisecond. So I looked at the hype, and then I looked at the cost benefit analysis done for this stuff. And like the other cases in late lessons, early warnings, they tend to be done by the industry itself in the beginning. They put out, they say, oh, we've done a cost benefit analysis. Very rare do you find at the beginning of a technology, or even 20 years down the track, as in the case of the mobile phones, are there any good independent analyses of the real costs and the real benefits? And then you said, well, what actual studies have been done on the safety of 5G? And then you looked at this lovely video of the US Congress in 2019, where a top US senator parades the industry in front of himself and says, what studies have you done on 5G that can tell me that there are likely to be no health effects from it? And they said, we haven't done any, basically. And he said and concluded, so we're flying blind with 5G. Yes, we are. So this is totally irresponsible. If 5G was a pharmaceutical or a pesticide, it would have to be pre-market tested with at least a modicum of studies done to establish that it would not be harmful. They haven't been done. Hence, 250 scientists plus, who are EMF experts, wrote to the UN and the EU around about 2015, repeated since, saying there should be a moratorium on the rollout of 5G until the safety studies are done. The consumer will not notice the difference between 40 milliseconds and 1 millisecond, and most of the benefits that we get from 4G would still obviously be there. So I've made about 20, about 12, 13 other similarities between the historical trajectory of the case studies in the Late Lessons, Early Warnings book and what was happening with 5G. And it horrified me to see how similar it was appearing. Now, of course, there are big differences between 5G and asbestos and lead in petrol, but they tend to encourage you to be even more careful, because it's things like the complexities of the exposure. The frequencies, the modulations, the peaks, the pulses, and other characteristics of the exposure within EMF, RFR from radio frequencies fields, is far more complex than ever asbestos was. I have found it, of the 50 or so agents I've studied for the last 50 years, this is by far and away the most complex. And you can't really grasp the thing until you have a kind of a working knowledge of the physics, of the chemistry, of the biology, of the engineering, of toxicology and epidemiology. And as often with science, the more scientific progress we make, the harder this multidisciplinary holistic approach or systems approach becomes to achieve. And when you talk to a physicist or a chemist or a toxicologist, they don't know what's going on in the other fields next door to them. They often don't understand it. And so par excellence, this is one of the agents that cries out for multidisciplinary approaches, which is one of the reasons why this new body, the International Commission on Biological Effects of EMF, has been created, to try and bring together disciplines who don't normally understand or know each other very well, but whom we have to put together to help us to solve a complex problem with many disciplines interacting and understanding each other.
And in terms of the wireless radiation issue too, one of the problems is just the range of exposure. We're talking about exposing pregnant women. We're talking about exposing young children. We're talking about exposing children now for their entire lifetimes. We're talking about exposing just about everybody on the planet, whether or not you use a mobile phone. You're getting exposure from your neighbour's Wi-Fi, from the shopping centre, from your train, or wherever it might be. So unlike other exposures, there's probably no one on this planet who's not exposed to some extent to this radiation. And I think that separates this issue to some extent too.
That's right. So I'm just presenting a paper on October 27th to Collegium Ramazzini, which was created 40 years ago to honor Bernardino Ramazzini, who's the father of occupational health. I'm an amazing guy. Writes a book in 1700 called The Diseases of Workers, which is pretty much accurate right now. And there's a session there on RFR, and my contribution is to list the dozen similarities, some of which I've mentioned, between RFR and asbestos, and then some 15, 16, 17 differences between RFR and asbestos. And one of them is the passive smoking kind of component. We know that passive smoking can cause health problems in those who are not smokers, but who are in the vicinity of smokers. Hence the public regulations now to create smoke-free places in many areas. But the extent of the passive or environmental exposure to RFR is much, much greater, as you pointed out. So that problem is much greater than it was with passive smoking, and that creates issues of human rights. People have a right to have a pollution-free environment, and this is a gross environmental pollutant that now is ubiquitous. That causes scientific problems as well, because if we haven't got an unexposed population, how do you do a good, robust study showing a difference between exposed and unexposed? Which is why in the epi studies that have come through so far, the evidence really turns upon, as it were, separating out within the study population those who haven't used a phone very much from those who have used it a lot. And then you get a comparison within the study. But it's very hard nowadays to find an uncontaminated population. We've come across this issue before with climate change, where the pollutant was also gross and more or less everywhere, i.e. carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. A wonderful scientist decided to deal with that problem. He would go off to somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, as far away as possible from centers of industrialization. And it is the late 50s, and he put his monitoring instrument there for monitoring the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's that curve from the Mauna Loa Hawaiian island that gives us some of our most robust strength of evidence about climate change, because it shows you over the last 70 years now a very steady climbing, rising amount of CO2. So this issue of trying to find uncontaminated areas in order to do good science is a very good one. And the other point you make is about children. We know from the history of lead, it was the children who were most affected in terms of the brain damage from the lead in the air from the leaded petrol. And it was a wonderful study by Needleman, who took 2,000 teeth, the milk teeth from children, via schools, because he wanted to work out how to get a measure of lead exposure which wasn't a flow, which is what blood lead gives you. It gives you an idea as to the amount of lead that's flowing through the body. But after a while, that lead disappears from the blood and goes into the stock of your bones. And it's that stock of accumulated lead that determines, as it were, your risk. So dear old Needleman said, how the hell can I get a measure out of human beings of a stock from their bones? And he suddenly thought, milk teeth, the ones that drop out when the child is 5. So in Pittsburgh, he goes around all these schools and does a deal with the teachers and the kids, and they bring in little envelopes with their name on, their age and everything, about 2,500 teeth. He gives it to the chemists. They just run it through and measure the amount of lead in those teeth. He then takes the kids between 7 and 9 and perhaps 11, I forget the exact when he terminated the study, and he does IQ tests. And he then measures the IQ in the 2,000 kids and then correlates that with the amount of lead in them from their teeth. And he showed a tremendously impressive, very robust graph. This is 1979, showing that the more lead in the teeth of the kids, the dumber they were. And that was the beginning of the end of lead in petrol. It took a while, but the tragedy is, and you read about it in the chapter. Top biologically inclined professors at the one-day trial of leaded petrol in 1925 in the US said this stuff will do damage to people in cities, but it will happen so insidiously that the public and governments won't wake up to it for several decades. And he said that in 1925. He was then harassed, by the way, Professor Henderson. He lost contracts to the Bureau of Mines and other powerful forces who hated what he said, but he was so on the ball. So children are in this area also much more at risk because of simple, obvious things like their heads are smaller. So you put a phone here and the radiation can get into the middle of the head more than it can a bigger head of an adult. The ear is thinner, the skull is thinner, and they're developing faster anyway biologically. So we know that they are going to be far more sensitive to radiations from mobile phones and other devices than adults, and ditto the fetus. In the old days, and you read this in the chapter on mercury pollution from Minamata Bay in the Japan in 1956, where the mercury from an outfall pipe from a chemical factory got into the fish. The people caught the fish, ate the fish, and the mothers in particular ate the fish, and the kids were born with gross defects. And at that time, the scientific paradigm was the fetus is protected by the placenta. The placenta is such a complex thing. It keeps the baby like this. It will keep out all poisons. That was the scientific paradigm of the day. Once people began to see these deformed kids and began to do the relevant research, that paradigm disappeared into the dustbin of history. And it became clear that certain molecules can just pass straight through the placenta and damage the kids. Nearer our field, radiation, dear old Alice Stewart in 1952, early 50s, did a huge study in the UK because she was worried about the rising leukemia rates in children. And she did a study showing that if you gave more than 2 or 3 X-rays to a pregnant woman, you doubled the rate of leukemia in the offspring, in the children. That went down like a load of lead, as it were, to the medical profession, because they loved their X-ray machines. They only had them for 2 or 3 decades, and they loved giving them to everybody. As we saw, they even put them in children's shoe shops, which was just dreadful. And she was pilloried and attacked and disbelieved and harassed. And it took 20 years of other people doing similar studies across the world before the Department of Health said to doctors and hospitals, don't give X-rays to pregnant women unless it's absolutely vital. So children and fetuses are very often the canaries in the gold mine sort of thing, just because they are more sensitive to many agents. So if we look after the children, we'll tend to look after ourselves better as well. In fact, thinking about it, I just remember in 1999, the World Health Organization had a big 5-year conference between ministers of health and ministers of environment. They meet every 5 years, and they had got a space on the agenda for an emerging issue, an area that I was charged with looking at. And I said, put in children and environmental health, because I knew a wonderful professor who's in Collegium Ramazzini, who in 1992 had produced a report on pesticides showing that children and fetuses were just not being protected from pesticides. And he put, as it were, children's health on the scientific agenda. So we picked it up in 1999, stuffed it into the World Health Organization conference that year in London, and they then had the next one 5 years on in Budapest, focusing solely on risks to children. So it was a big issue in those days. It's gone off the boil a little bit, I think, because I don't know why things rise and fall in terms of people's interest. But for me, fetuses and children are still a major area of concern for practically all hazardous agents, and in particular RFR.
Oh, that's very interesting. And you've said that you think we ought to be taking precautions. We can see that at a societal level, it's not happening. We can see that our governments are not helping us to reduce our exposure or encouraging us to reduce our exposure. We can see that international standards agencies are not providing us with adequate protection. So it comes back to us as individuals to protect ourselves. And that means that it comes back to us as parents or grandparents to protect the kids. And one of the concerns for me is the number of wireless devices, let's say, that are on the market, that are in kids' toys, that are in kids' nappies, that are in kids' pajamas, that are in kids' potties, that are everywhere. And you have to ask the question, first of all, do we need these things? And secondly, why are we irradiating these precious and vulnerable kids absolutely unnecessarily, given the risks and given the fact that they've got a potential lifetime of exposure? So I don't know your thoughts on that, David.
Yeah, well, as we saw with ionizing radiations, when they thought it was the best thing since sliced bread to have this ionizing radiation to do type X-rays and things, which did bring enormous benefits, of course. But then allowing it to escape, as it were, from the medical field and put X-ray machines in shoe shops to measure children's feet in the 1950s, that was what I call a trivial and non-essential use of that technology. Of course, eventually it was phased out, but it introduces this principle of triviality. I call it the triviality principle, or it's better perhaps called the essential uses principle. I say that because when the CFC story struck, which was, using underarm deodorants with CFC gases in there to propel the deodorant, we realized that these gases, CFCs from the underarm deodorants and other sprays, were floating up 25 kilometers above our heads and making a hole in the ozone layer. Well, that was only really established in 1985. Quite soon after that, the world said, oh my God, this is the only layer that protects us from the radiations from the sun. And other planets that don't have this protection that we have from our atmosphere, they're dead or roasting hot, or it's a mess. So we've got a pretty unique structure here called the planet, and it's got this lovely protective ozone layer out there, and we're punching holes in it. So the world woke up pretty quickly after the discovery of the hole. So by the time you get to 1987, you get the Montreal Protocol global, trying to phase out initially the CFCs and other ozone depleting gases. And in that treaty, they talked about essential and non-essential uses. For instance, there were some CFCs used in asthma sprays at that time, which were medically very useful for children. And we didn't at that time know how to do it without the CFCs. So we said, okay, for essential uses, you can continue to use CFCs for say 5 or 10 years or whatever. But so that introduced this idea of essential and non-essential. We should really be picking that up with some force now and applying it in this field of RFR and saying, putting RFR into baby soothers or baby alarms or the dozens of other subjects that you can, or other products that you can find on the website of the Environmental Health Trust, and probably on your website as well. They are illustrations or demonstrations of trivialities, non-essential uses. They ought not to be on the market. Eventually, governments will wake up and will ban them, hopefully, like they did X-rays in shoe shops. So I think we are on the cusp, hopefully, of being able to eliminate these products. And what you're doing is alerting people, perhaps before the governments eliminate those products, to the realities of them, so that perhaps they don't buy them or don't use them, because they are giving small but not insignificant risks to their children and their fetuses and so on.
Well, even if it's small, it's cumulative amounts of radiation that are the problem, because
and unnecessary.
Yes,
really.
That's right.
And you're quite right. It adds to all the other doses you're getting from everywhere else,
Yes.
So even taking a little bit out does help. That brings another little illustration from history again. Antibiotics in animal feed. Europe, but not China and not America, have now banned antibiotics being put into animal feed, because in the 50s it was discovered by chance that they made the cattle and the pigs grow faster and fatter. And it was a great boon for agriculture at that time. But some scientists stepped back, in particular in the UK in 1969, and said, wait a minute, why are we putting antibiotics in the animal food chain? Because we eat the animals and then we get the antibiotics. So we don't want that to happen. So after a long battle, antibiotics were removed from the food chain via that route. But during the debates, people said, oh, well, the overuse of antibiotics via the doctor and via people not using them properly and using too many of them is much the greater evil. which is true, of course, but you don't, as it were, stop yourself from removing a part of a problem that you can easily remove just because there are bigger parts of the problem that are perhaps more difficult to deal with. And this is the case in the RFR thing. We can take out the trivial uses in baby products and so on without destroying the telecoms industry, for example.
Well, that's right. And I think that there are a lot of things that we use as adults too that we can start to think about and decide, well, do I actually need to have my mobile phone beside my head as I sleep all night as an alarm? Can I not get a battery operated alarm, for example? Or can I not use, let me show you.
Yeah.
Can you
Oh,
see
right.
it?
The landline, yes.
The old landline phone.
I love using a landline. I love using a landline. It's usually far more secure. So you go on WhatsApp a lot of the time with your mobile phone, and either party at either end keeps losing the signal and so on.
Absolutely.
Landlines are great. That
That's
brings
right.
out another. Yeah, in terms of your own preventative measures, remember if you're in a box, and the box could
Mm,
be a car, a train, a bus, an elevator, then
mm.
particularly if it's metallic, then the phone will give you a surge of extra RFR in order for you to get the right signal and to carry on talking and so on. So simple answer, don't use phones in closed metal boxes like cars and trains and tubes and so on, and
That's right.
elevators.
That's right.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say to me, when we talk about Wi-Fi, they say, "Oh yeah, I have to have Wi-Fi," and I say, "Why?" Well, I need internet. And what people don't realize is that Wi-Fi and internet are two separate things. You don't have to have Wi-Fi to have internet. You can have this radical thing called wired internet, which
Yeah.
is what I'm
Yeah.
talking to you on at the moment, which is a more reliable form of internet anyway, and there's
Yeah.
no exposure. So these are just a couple of examples, but just
Yes.
to put in people's mind the idea that there are ways of doing things that don't
Yes.
involve exposing you or exposing your kids or exposing your fetus or your brand new
Yes.
baby
Yes.
to radiation unnecessarily. So it
That's
might just
right.
be
That's right. Yeah.
something
But
to
I
think
think it's
about.
I confess I haven't had time because I've been trying to do 3,000 papers on this stuff and other things. I haven't had time to bring a wired solution into my own house here. I do take precautions in terms of being away from the computer and the phone and the router,
Mm,
but it's still a wireless house.
mm,
And I'm about to get fiber optics delivered to the house by
ah,
companies who are making a big pitch for that right now. But
mm,
I bet when I go and ask them to say, can you please come into the house and provide wired places for 2 or 3 workstations for the computers? I'm
mm.
sure I'm going to find a problem. They'll probably say, "Oh, it's not our job. We don't know how to do it, or whatever." So, from the point of view of the consumer, getting your
Mm.
house back into a wired system might be a bit more complicated than just holding the phone away from your head, as a for instance.
Yes, well, that's one thing that we help people with in Australia. We have a different setup here because we have National Broadband Network, which is called NBN or abbreviated to NBN, and that's
Yeah,
changed the way that we connect to the internet and to connect via phone. But there are still ways of doing things. So I think there will be in your country, I'm sure, people who can help you, and I think that
yeah,
that applies anywhere. But hopefully, after this conversation,
yes.
a lot of people will be thinking about these questions too.
Yes, yes,
So,
yes. There's a couple of books about the issue of wired versus non-wired, and I read some
yeah.
evidence today, which really struck home to me. I once wrote a pamphlet for a trade union in 1995, talking about leaving industrial dinosaurs behind and moving to an eco-efficient economy, whereby we
Mm,
would use much less fossil fuels, much less materials of nature. We would just become more eco-efficient. We'd meet our needs, but we'd say 20 times less throughput of
mm,
energy, particularly fossil fuel energy,
yeah.
and materials. And I coined the phrase industrial dinosaurs. And this man was writing about the wireless field. He said, basically, it's now an industrial dinosaur, really.
Ah.
In relation to the more sophisticated, smarter, more secure, faster, risk-free, relatively risk-free fields of wired solutions and optical fibers and other terms I've forgotten. But I was struck by how perhaps we ought to have a narrative about dinosaurs versus
Mm.
smarter stuff. And of course, the industry in the Internet of Things hype and rhetoric have captured the smart word and use it all the time to talk about, smart this, smart that, smart the other. But maybe we should confront that head on and say, wait a minute, of the two competing type technologies here, wired and wireless, which is really the smart one?
Well, I use the word wise. I say it may be smart, but it's not wise. I
Well,
like.
yeah, that's an excellent point, because at the end of the 2000, on the end of the 1,000 pages of the two volumes of Late Lessons from Early Warnings, in both Volume 1 and Volume 2, we end up using the wise word. We say that, Homo. For me, we've called ourselves Homo sapiens, the wise ones. We don't really demonstrate that
Ah,
at all. So I
yes.
currently call ourselves Homo stupidus because I think most of the time we are stupid rather than wise. And we could use foresight, the precautionary principle, which should have been called the foresight principle. That's a better translation from the
Mm,
original German, where it was invented in the 1980s to deal with acid rain and damage to trees. So the foresight principle allows you to take action early enough in a timely manner to both preserve health and planet and also to stimulate innovation, as we were
yes.
discussing a few minutes ago, between wired and wireless.
Mm,
Uh, we show with the case studies that when precaution has been used, which is rare in those case studies, perhaps 7 out of the 35, you've got some element of precaution being adopted. The French ban on neonicotinoids, pesticides, as a for instance, is one example. When you do that, you stimulate innovation because, of
yes.
course, you stop a particular technological pathway, which is leading us down into a harmful garden, as it were, and we encourage bright people to think differently and produce a benefit stream which doesn't have the same likelihood of harm. And that stimulates innovation. So,
Oh,
the PP not only helps to protect ourselves in a timely way, it also stimulates better and wiser innovation.
well, also it stimulates the economy because if people choose to purchase products that are safer, then it's going to stimulate those businesses and perhaps inspire others to be producing safer products as well. So that, I feel like as a society, there's a lot that we can do as individuals that will
Mm.
make things better for our own
Mm.
homes and families, but also that help to move society in a positive direction as well.
Yes, yes.
So,
I think as an individual, if you do the three things of trying to minimize your own exposures right now, which you can,
mm,
secondly, write to the telecoms companies saying, why are you giving warning signals about this stuff? What's your view about it? They'll just say, oh, we hide behind ICNUP. But increasingly, the CEOs will be thinking, is this a smart move now? Probably not. And the third
yeah.
thing, write to the MPs, your government representatives, your
Mm,
parliamentarians, and so on, to say,
mm,
when are you going to come in and instruct the telecoms industries to produce lower exposure limits and to reduce the exposure limits to which we are exposed, which needs government action, really.
mm.
So each person can do the three things: protect
Yep,
themselves and then lobby companies and lobby governments.
that's absolutely right. So it's very positive. We will look forward to a much better future.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so. Yeah. One is encouraged by the younger generations picking. I mean, look at the young women and girls, taking enormous risks in Iran right now. Young people and the young people's movement on climate change. As the Friday schools actions by hundreds of thousands of young people taking action on climate change. I get the feeling that the younger generation